The incorporation of the burden of premature mortality and disability into one summary measure requires the common metric. So as you can see, they were absolutely certain already, the researchers that introduced this methodology, that the modern type of diseases, of chronic non-infectious diseases, mostly affect the disability and the premature mortality of the population, because at first glance everything looked okay. The life expectancy of the population in modern developed countries increased year after year. But if you take a look at the not the life expectancy, but the healthy life expectancy of a population, you'll soon find out that it hasn't increased that much. So it has to be assessed separately. Now, since the late 1940s, researchers have generally agreed that time is an appropriate currency. So you have to calculate time in years lost because of premature death and because of years lived with a disability. A range of such time-based measures has been used in different countries. For example, the so-called quality-adjusted life year already existed as a measure of time spent free of disease. Years of life spent free of disease, so a sort of healthy life expectancy. For the global burden of disease study, an internationally standardized form, the quality adjusted life year, was developed, called the disability adjusted life year. So this is the most important thing that we are going to discuss in this presentation, these so-called DALYs, disability adjusted life years, because they are the generally accepted methodology nowadays to assess the burden of disease. The initiative for preparing this new methodology came from the WHO, and the final metric, the disability adjusted life year, was prepared together by the World Health Organization and the World Bank. They worked in close cooperation. So this is the objective way to measure, to assess the burden of disease nowadays. Prior to that, mostly subjective and not so accurate measures were used. So, for example, they would say that a major disease is a disease where many people in active ages or in child ages are affected, which leads to high mortality, that leads to high disability, that places burden on the families of the affected, that require specialized medical care, incur expenses on the health system, etc., etc. So many criteria were introduced, and theoretically, if a disease met 3 or more of the proposed criteria, it was considered a major disease. So a leading problem for this country, but this was a very subjective methodology. Now, later, with the introduction of these disability-adjusted life years, things became way more objective, because in order to proclaim a disease, a major disease nowadays, you have to demonstrate that in this particular country, it leads to a large number of disability-adjusted life years. So, for example, if you identify a disease that has, let's say, 10 disability-adjusted life years, 10 disability-adjusted life years are lost from the life of an average citizen, then this objectively is a major disease. As for the burden of disease in general, the burden of disease is, of course, mostly caused by acute diseases in underdeveloped countries. It is mostly caused by NCDs, non-communicable diseases, in developed and highly developed countries. And in developing countries, as they say, we can observe the double burden of disease. That is, at the same time, developing societies are plagued by the traditional diseases of the past, acute diseases, plus the new modern diseases of civilization. You have to learn to come on time because we are interrupting the presentation all the time, and I may stop doing this in the end once I run out of patience. Okay, let's continue with the slide now. The disability-adjusted life year expresses years of life lost to premature death and years lived with disability of specified severity and duration. One daily is the equivalent of one lost year of healthy life. Now, how to define premature deaths? What do we consider premature mortality when calculating days? Here you see one proposed methodology. The premature death was initially defined as one that occurs before the age to which a person could have expected to survive if he was a member of a model population, where life expectancy at birth equals the life expectancy at birth for Japan. Nowadays, most countries do not use this methodology when they calculate dailies. In fact, they will calculate dailies in view of life expectancy in their own country. So, for example, if we take Bulgaria, if we have a certain generation with an average life expectancy of, let's say, 74, it means that anyone who has died before the age of 74 should be considered prematurely dead. So, for example, we have two different diseases, and we would like to know which of these two produces a larger burden of disease. So, how to calculate the dailies then? Since it's premature death or disability, whatever comes first. For example, on one hand, you have a person who has died of massive myocardial infarction or stroke at the age of 70. As a consequence of poorly controlled, imperfectly controlled arterial blood pressure in essential arterial hypertension. So, for this person, the essential hypertension will produce dailies of 4. So, 4 disability-adjusted life years are lost. If we compare him with another person who has developed, for example, Alzheimer's disease, let's say he has developed he has exhibited symptoms of the Alzheimer's disease at 68. And when he turned 74, he's still alive. He died later. Does this mean that the burden of disease here is smaller? No, it is in fact higher, because it is 74 minus 68. So it turns out that Alzheimer's disease produces higher burden of disease. And of course, you have to calculate this for all patients and sum up. What you get in the end is an average burden of disease for all patients living with Alzheimer's disease or essential arterial hypertension will be the final count. And then you will know which of the two diseases is a major disease for this country, this particular country, or maybe both or none of them. That's, of course, entirely country dependent. So it's not necessarily mortality that apparently that produces a burden of disease, but in most cases it will be disability. So you may have some diseases that by nature do not produce so much mortality, but they produce a lot of disability, a lot of years of life lost, so to speak, because of disability, and they will supersede other diseases. They will be established as the primary source of the burden of disease and will become a new priority for the health system, because health systems made this mistake in the past. They focused exclusively on diseases producing high mortality, so they would be interested in things like AIDS or different cardiovascular, cerebrovascular incidents, and they had the tendency to ignore diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, different types of osteochondrosis, disc, vertebrate spinal discs, protrusions, hernia, etc., etc., which produce a lot of disability but not so much mortality, so they were somehow left unnoticed in the past by the health system. And nowadays, modern health systems, since they anyway operate with people, with citizens who have a high life expectancy, focus more on disability. So the long-term suffering by patients who are limited in their functionality, in their basic capabilities. Because, of course, lower back pain will not kill you, or chronic neck pain, but it is a debilitating condition. So it should be included in the measures of disease burden. Okay, I'll skip some parts which are not so important now. Results from the study, the global study, demonstrated clearly that disability plays a central role in determining the overall health status of a population. And also it turned out that the leading causes of disability are substantially different from the leading causes of death. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa and India, together accounted for more than 40% of the total global burden of disease in 1990, even though they made up 26% of the world's population. In contrast, Europe had 1/5 of the world's population, but it had less than 12% of the total disease burden. China emerged even back then as substantially the healthiest of the developing regions, with 15% of the global disease burden, even though it had 1/5 of the world's population. Major causes of disease burden. While the leading causes of disease burden in 1990, namely lower respiratory infections, all kinds of infectious diarrhea, perinatal causes of death may come as no surprise. The fact that depression was the fourth leading cause was perhaps unexpected, clinical depression. Indeed, the study showed that the burden of psychiatric conditions had been heavily underestimated up until then. Of the 10 leading causes of disability worldwide, in 1995 were psychiatric conditions: unipolar depression, alcohol abuse, bipolar affective disorder, schizophrenia, and obsessive compulsive disorder. Unipolar depression alone was responsible for more than 1 in every 10 years of life lived with a disability worldwide. Altogether, psychiatric and neurologic conditions accounted for 28% of all years lived with disability, compared with only 1.4% of all deaths. The predominance of these conditions is by no means restricted to rich countries, something that one may initially believe. Their burden is the highest everywhere. The only region for which they were not the leading cause of disability and or premature death was sub-Saharan Africa. Major causes of disease burden continued, and now let's mention some of the widespread and common risk factors as well. Alcohol use was, or alcohol abuse rather, was the leading cause of male disability. It came 10th in women in developed regions. More surprisingly, it was fourth for men in developing regions. The remaining important causes of years lived with disability were anemia, falls, road traffic accidents, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and osteoarthritis. So, why do we focus on the study from the 1992? It was a long time ago, after all. Well, first of all, the situation hasn't changed much, and second, it was a very large and punctual study, and it hasn't been repeated to this day. So instead of this synchronous study globally, nowadays we have different statistics coming from different countries. So we are trying to construct, somehow solve the puzzle using elements from here and there. And from what we see, the overall picture hasn't changed in the last 30 years. The traditional causes of disease burden in developing countries: communicable diseases, maternal and perinatal conditions, plus nutritional deficiencies remained of major concern. They accounted for only 7% of the burden in developed countries, which comes as no surprise. Less than 9% in Eastern Europe, so the former socialist countries allied with the Soviet Union, but they made up more than 40% of the total global burden of disease. For the developing regions, 49%. Even in China, where the epidemiological transition is far advanced and China is supposed to become a developed country soon, a quarter of years of healthy life lost were due to this group. China is, of course, expected to become officially a developed country much earlier than India. As for such large and dynamic economies as Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, the prospects there are a bit unclear. No one can tell whether they will become developed countries in the near future. For quite some time, they will remain developing countries. Of course, people get confused sometimes because of their relatively strong economies. Many people wrongly believe that countries such as Brazil or South Africa are developed countries, but they're nowhere near. Worldwide, 5 out of 10 leading causes of disease burden are group 1 conditions: lower respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, perinatal conditions, tuberculosis, and measles. Now, 6 differences in disease burden. It turns out that there are such gender differences as well. Although girls and boys suffer from broadly similar health problems in infancy and early childhood, striking sex differences emerge in adults. Firstly, and most obviously, women suffer disproportionately from their reproductive role. Although the burden of reproductive ill health is almost entirely confined to the developing regions, it is so great that even worldwide, maternal conditions make up 3 out of the 10 leading causes of disease burden in women aged 15 to 44. Now, in developing regions, the corresponding number is 5 out of 10. So 5 out of the 10 leading causes of disability-adjusted life years lost are related to reproductive health. So things like unsafe abortion and chlamydia infections. The study revealed that poor health is reproductive health is not only concern for women. For men aged 15 to 44, another leading and prominent cause of premature death and disability emerges. It is road traffic accidents. Second greatest in developing regions, surpassed only by depression, alcohol. Also, alcohol abuse, violence, tuberculosis, war, bipolar affective disorder, suicide, schizophrenia, iron deficiency, anemia make up the remainder of the list for developing countries. It's not, of course, that you don't find many cases of iron deficiency anemia, particularly in women in reproductive age in developed countries, but the percentage is smaller. It's usually less than 15% of the women in reproductive age being affected. That's the statistics for developed and highly developed countries. And up until recently, road traffic accidents in developing regions have received relatively little attention. Nowadays, they are recognized as a major problem. And if you take a look at Europe, you'll see that even some European countries are badly affected by premature mortality and disability caused by road traffic accidents. So traffic safety is quite poor. This is typical of most Balkan countries, by the way. They don't look like the rest of Europe. They look more like developing countries in this respect, in view of traffic safety. Assessment of risk factors. Exposure to certain hazards such as tobacco, alcohol, unsafe sex, poor sanitation can significantly increase the individual risk of developing a chronic condition. Until this global burden of disease, everyone measured only the final outcomes, but not so much the spread of these risk factors among the population. The global burden of disease assessed that the mortality and loss of healthy life can be attributed to each of the 10 major risk factors in each region. These risk factors are malnutrition, poor water supply, sanitation, personal and domestic hygiene, unsafe sex, tobacco use, alcohol use, occupation, hypertension, physical activity, illicit drug use, and air pollution. Of course, they'll be pronounced differently in different regions of the world. Major inequalities exist between regions and between men and women in the experienced burden of different risk factors. For example, the consequences of unsafe sex in terms of infections and complications of unwanted pregnancy are borne disproportionately by women. They represent a particular problem for women in sub-Saharan Africa. Their unsafe sex as a risk factor produces 1/3 of the total disease burden. Now, tobacco and alcohol, owing to longer exposures, cause the heaviest burden in many developed countries. They, both of them together, account for more than 1/5 of the total burden of disease in 1990. In Asia, the situation is rapidly changing, and it gets more and more similar to the situation in developed countries. Okay, the impact of alcohol varies between regions, not only because of the different levels of use in each population, but also because of differences in the age structure of the affected populations. Now, alcohol consumption in low doses has been consistently demonstrated in many epidemiologic studies to provide some protection against death from ischemic heart disease, but at the same time, it significantly increases the risk of other diseases such as pancreatitis, several types of cancer, liver cirrhosis, and many injuries. So, because of its mild and suspected, rather than absolutely certain, protective effect against cardiovascular diseases in highly developed countries, it may turn out in the end that alcohol prevents about as many deaths as it causes. Still, it poses a severe disease burden in even in rich countries because it causes many injuries and premature deaths among younger men in particular. So the end net result is a large number of years lived with disability and years of life lost prematurely. In sub-Saharan Africa, ischemic heart disease is relatively uncommon. The protective effect of alcohol is far outweighed by its harmful role in deaths and disability due to injuries. The contribution of alcohol to injuries is also extremely high in Latin America and the Caribbean, where alcohol use accounts for almost 10% of the total disease and injury burden. Diseases as risk factors for other diseases. So things may get a bit complicated here because sometimes you wonder sometimes you wonder whether this condition is more important as a disease in itself or as a precondition for other diseases. Okay. For example, diabetes mellitus, diabetes type 2, and to some extent diabetes type 1, but of course we can't directly affect the incidence of diabetes type 1 strongly increases the individual's risk of developing ischemic heart disease and stroke. So here's an example of a disease that is not just important in itself, but it leads to other diseases in turn. Infection with hepatitis B increases the risk of developing liver cancer and liver cirrhosis. So traditional methods of assessing deaths by the single underlying cause will fail to capture these relationships because they will measure each of these diseases as separate entities, completely unrelated, which is not a proper way of addressing them. So the global burden of disease for the first time tried to estimate how much of the total disease burden would be averted if the condition was estimated before time in each of the affected countries. So the most dramatic differences between directly coded and total burden as a result emerged when assessing the situation for diabetes type 2, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C, because they are important apparently both as diseases in themselves and precursors of other important diseases. Leading causes of disease burden in 2020. So a prediction was made in the global burden of disease study what the situation will be in 2020, and remarkably, all of these predictions came true 30 years later. So if we take a quick look at the predictions made back then, we will easily see that all of these predictions were fulfilled later. They became effective. Now, when disability is taken into account as well as that, A different view of the future emerges, one that emphasizes adult health problems still further. By 2020, the disease burden due to communicable diseases, maternal and perinatal conditions, and nutritional deficiencies continued to fall. But the burden attributable to non-communicable diseases rose sharply, as well as the burden from injuries, which is a bit surprising because in the past, injuries, direct trauma were considered typical acute pathology, so they were expected to happen only in underdeveloped countries. But in the end, it turned out that injuries remain a leading cause of disability and premature mortality in developed countries as well, because of the problems with traffic safety and because of the problems of the extremely aged population. Because all of these old people are very prone to sudden falls, and then, of course, this coupled with the osteoporosis so widespread among this population, you have a large burden of disease being posed in the end. In 1990, the three leading causes of disease burden were in descending order: pneumonia, diarrheal diseases, perinatal conditions. For 2020, they were supposed to be, and they became replaced by ischemic heart disease, clinical depression, and road traffic accidents. Pneumonia fell to 6th place, diarrheal diseases to 9th, and perinatal conditions to 11th. Measles in 8th place in 1990 dropped to 25th. However, not all infectious diseases have declined. Tuberculosis keeps its position more or less, and also HIV/AIDS. As with the 1990 assessment, neuropsychiatric conditions emerge as a highly significant component of the global disease burden. Psychiatric and neurologic conditions increase their share of the total global burden by almost half. And the burden of disease attributable to tobacco outweighs that caused by any other single disease. From its 1990 level, 2.6% of all disease burden caused, so diseases as a consequence of tobacco consumption, it rises to 9% for 2020. Okay, so not surprisingly, these changes are not evenly dispersed worldwide. The total number of dailies in highly developed countries falls, while the total dailies burden in sub-Saharan Africa, which we all know by now is a very important region because most of the population growth currently happens there. It's a reservoir, so to speak, for humankind. Future replacements for the humankind come mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, especially for the European population. This is the future source of migrants and refugees for Europe. And they're in quite poor health conditions. The total number of dailies ever increases there, mostly because of a steep rise from the consequences of road accidents, war, and AIDS. Okay, so yes, we can skip this now. You may read it before the exam, some international strategies that are supposed to tackle this burden of disease, but they mostly simply identify the problems. This here, of course, is an important notion. Lifestyle factors are recognized as behavioral risk factors are recognized as the leading risk factors in the etiology of the current pathology in highly developed countries. So an enormous amount of money is spent on influencing consumer behavior on the market through advertising. Influences on lifestyles are considered of primary importance by all governments. But of course, we need here further investments in such, at least mass media campaigns in the future. Here's the Rose paradox of prevention, which you should be aware of as a theoretical concept. It explains why, by nature, human societies are not so interested in prevention as much as they are interested in direct diagnostics and treatment. Even though, of course, it doesn't seem initially like a rational behavior. It goes without saying that prevention has a much higher potential to decrease the burden of disease in comparison to direct diagnosis and treatment. We all know already that chronic non-infectious diseases are incurable, that the best possible course of action is to prevent them. But the paradox goes like this, that eliminating risk factors for those at highest risk of the disease will only have limited impact at population levels, as the majority of the disease burden in the population comes from people with moderate risk, who will personally benefit very little by avoiding the risk determinants in question. Now, it's hard to demonstrate, to explain to an individual how important it is for him to invest in healthy lifestyles if you can't directly scare him by saying, okay, you do this or this, you're engaged in this risky behavior. It means that in 5 years, for example, you'll get the disease, or in 3 years, 10 years, etc., etc. But you probably know by now that epidemiology doesn't work like this. We cannot make such predictions. For example, if we see a group of people who are moderate smokers, not some heavy chain smokers, so for example, they smoke something like 10 cigarettes per day, you can, of course, tell them that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer, including small cell lung cancer that is so resistant to any kind of therapy that many times, or to squamous cell laryngeal carcinoma that many times. But if they ask you, what's the individual risk for me? What can you tell them? Basically nothing, because epidemiology can predict only the population effect. So, for example, you have a group of 100 people in front of you. You know that in the course of 10 years, 10 of them will get the disease, but you can't identify these 10 persons. You don't know who they are. So many of them may decide that the risk is then unconvincing, it's worth it. Why do I care? If it's 10 out of 100, maybe it won't be me getting the disease, and yes, maybe it won't be them. I've probably provided the example here because we don't explain these things in military terms. Perhaps people don't get scared enough. They think that they can drink and smoke and have physical inactivity and poor diet, etc., etc., sedentary lifestyles, more or less in moderation, and then maybe it won't be them getting the final fatal condition considered important to prevent. If they were on the battlefield, of course, they wouldn't think like this, because imagine the other front line, the front line of enemies shooting at you. Are you going to charge them head on, knowing that out of, let's say, 100 soldiers in your company, only 10 will die on the way there? Are you going to charge them through the field? Of course not. Not any sane individual would do that. So everyone will remain dug deep in until you're guaranteed you can advance. So you've seen the airstrike, the artillery strike on enemy positions, so you expect you won't be met by crossfire when you advance. But in ordinary civil life, the danger does not seem so looming, even though the risks for your wife are more or less the same as on the battlefield. But somehow it seems less threatening. So unless you can demonstrate clearly the individual risk for this patient, he will not remain convinced, and maybe he won't change anything about his lifestyle, because somehow things do not seem so pressing for him. So that's an attempt to explain in simple terms the Rosie's paradox, why seemingly everyone seems unperturbed even when you somehow communicated the risks present to the general public. Why everyone in the end thinks that, well, it doesn't concern me. I can be engaged in risky behaviors, and maybe it won't be me getting the disease after all. So, although many non-communicable diseases to continue are preventable, a large proportion are not, even under optimal circumstances. So this should be clear too. Social determinants of disease, of course, should also be addressed, and this is easy in developed countries, but not so easy in developing and underdeveloped countries. For example, the importance of clean drinking water, poverty elimination, malnutrition, etc., have been clearly demonstrated. So it turns out in the end that many of the health problems of underdeveloped countries are in fact not health problems. They are a consequence of economical problems. So until you solve them first, it makes no sense to focus so much on health problems. Now, of course, in highly developed countries, we can isolate health problems because we have more or less solved the economic ones. Okay. Wealthy countries spend 90% of the world's health resources, even though they exhibit 10% of the world's health problems. Of course, it's a problem that is easily identifiable. Global pharmaceutical companies, it is easy to demonstrate, are mostly working on new drugs for the prevailing health conditions in highly developed countries because they have a market for their drugs there, but they don't work so much on treatments for underdeveloped countries. For example, the formulation of new antibiotics is very slow. It almost doesn't happen at all because global pharmaceutical companies prefer to focus instead on cardiovascular diseases and cancer because they can sell their new drugs at very high prices in highly developed countries. And even though the problems of underdeveloped countries are somewhat different and they affect a much larger population, who cares when there aren't enough paying consumers for drugs in these poor markets? Okay, we can skip this now. Some of the ways are mentioned to address risk factors in developed countries. Read these ones before the final exam. The types of prevention. Now, a quick reminder of this, how prevention works in general. Now, to put it in simple terms, you have primordial prevention. You don't have this in all textbooks. You have primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So basically, primordial prevention boils down to eliminating some widespread and common risk factors. So, for example, if you eliminate or reduce tobacco consumption and alcohol consumption or air pollution, this is primordial prevention. And of course, prevention comes after health promotion, which addresses the needs of healthy populations. Health promotion is, in fact, increasing the resistance to disease because it increases the functional capacity, the reserve, the functional reserves of a population that is currently healthy. So all kinds of investments, of course, in amateur sports activities, in cleaner environment are considered health promotion. Then comes primordial prevention. And the next stage of prevention is primary prevention. Primary prevention means preventing the disease altogether in the group, in the high-risk groups, in the population at risk. So primary prevention is already specific. If we say health promotion, it means these are activities targeted at the whole population. mostly healthy individuals. If we say prevention, it means that we already target specific diseases. That's why probably the correct way to say this is to put this is health promotion and disease prevention. Prevention is disease specific. So if we have health promotion, it works for the whole population of Bulgaria, Greece, Europe, whatever. If we say disease prevention, we don't have any such thing as disease prevention in general. No, we have prevention of hepatitis B, prevention of hepatitis C, prevention of active tuberculosis, etc., etc. Primordial prevention is addressing the common risk factors. Primary prevention is preventing the disease in the population at risk. So, for example, if you introduce a hepatitis B vaccine for all newborns, that's primary prevention. Then you have the next stage, which is secondary prevention, which means that we weren't able to prevent the disease, but at least we are trying to diagnose it as early as possible. So secondary prevention is early diagnosis, in the hope that you will find many cases of hidden, latent disease in the very initial stage. Secondary prevention. And finally, you have tertiary prevention. So what's left for tertiary prevention? If we did not make the population resistant to disease, we did not eliminate the widespread risk factors, we did not prevent the disease in the population at risk, we did not diagnose it early, what's left is at least to prevent the long-term complications. So, for example, dispensarization in Eastern Europe is an example of tertiary prevention. All of those programs for long-term follow-up on chronic conditions are represent an example for tertiary prevention. So if through strict control of blood sugar and systolic blood pressure levels, you manage to prevent the long-term complications such as ischemic stroke, hemorrhagic stroke, diabetic retinopathy, polyneuropathy, nephropathy, then you've achieved the aims of tertiary prevention. So you're trying to prevent the long-term complications, the peripheral lesions from the main disease. That's it. These are all the possible levels of prevention. As for screening, you should know by now what screening is. It's a program that targets a specific disease. It aims mostly to address parts of the population that are thought to be omitted from the general examinations program. Screening tries to quickly find many hidden, latent forms of the disease in question. It involves the usage of one and just one rapid diagnostic test, which should be pretty quick, rapid test, and one that is not particularly specific for the disease. So, of course, there will be many false positives in the context of a screening program. So, for example, you may have a screening program for breast cancer involving mammography only, or a screening program for cervical cancer involving a pap test only, so on and so forth. These are examples of screening programs. And of course, the problems of sensitivity and specificity are important here. They are inversely related. You either have high sensitivity or high specificity for a diagnostic test. And of course, in the context of screening programs, like I told you, we will always have the problem of many false positives. That's why, by the way, all the patients that tested positive in the context of a screening program have to be tested again by a different and more specific diagnostic test. What happens, for example, in the case of HIV/AIDS, I've also provided this example, is again something like this, because people suspected of having HIV, so being carriers of the HIV-1 or HIV-2 virus, are initially tested by the ELISA test, and it will produce some false positives, but the results are confirmed with Western blotting, immunoblotting, or PCR. And then, and only then, are patients informed that they are indeed seropositive. Okay, let's skip this now, but make sure to read it back at home. And let's take now a quick look again at the incidence and prevalence as measures of morbidity. And this will be it for today, this second presentation. It is much lighter, so in 40 minutes or so we'll be finished. Morbidity. Death rates are particularly useful for investigating diseases with a high case fatality. And we already mentioned, of course, incidence and prevalence in the previous days when we discussed epidemiology, but let's have some firm knowledge established now. However, many diseases have low case fatality. For example, most mental illnesses, musculoskeletal diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, chickenpox, mumps. In this situation, data on morbidity are more useful than mortality rates to assess the final burden of disease. Trends and explanations. Morbidity data are often helpful in clarifying the reasons for particular trends in mortality. Changes in death rates could be due to changes in morbidity rates or in case fatality. For example, the recent decline in cardiovascular disease mortality rates in many developed countries could be due to a fall in either incidence, suggesting improvements in primary prevention, or in case fatality, suggesting improvements in treatment. Because population age structures change with time, time trend analysis should be based on age, standardized morbidity, and mortality rates. Now, this is, by the way, an important precaution. you have to know how to treat epidemiological data. For example, we already saw something similar in demography when we discussed demography. You compare, for example, the crude birth rate, the general mortality in Turkey and Germany, in Tunisia and France, in Saudi Arabia, or rather, let's take a more striking example, in Iran and the United States. And you find out that you have lower mortality in Tunisia, Turkey, and Iran. What does that mean? Of course, it doesn't mean that Iran is a richer country than the United States. It doesn't mean that Iran has better healthcare. It doesn't mean that even that Iranian citizens necessarily have healthier lifestyles. And in the case of citizens of Saudi Arabia, it will certainly be untrue, or Turkey, for example. No, it means that the population in the highly developed countries, in the United States, in Germany, in France, is severely aged in comparison to the population in developing countries, or countries that have been developing countries not so long ago, because Turkey is a developed country, but it was a developing country not so long ago, so it still retains many of the demographic features of a developing country. And it turns out that age is, in fact, the primary influence here. Age is the single factor that mostly affects mortality, the probability of dying. We see something similar in the context of epidemiology. Let's say that we compare the incidence of cancer. Different localizations of cancer in the United States and Iran, or the United States and Saudi Arabia. And then you find you have more cases of breast cancer, colorectal carcinoma, lung cancer, etc., in the more developed country, in the highly developed country. What does that mean? If you ask any student who knows next to nothing, or you ask any of these charlatans involved in marketing healthy lifestyles, etc., because they're trying to sell you some new superfoods or something stupid like this, but eye-catching. If you ask them, they'll tell you that, okay, of course, that's perfectly understandable. The United States and other highly developed countries have higher cancer incidence and prevalence because citizens there eat processed food. They use their cars to move around instead of their legs, etc., etc. They are stressed because of their credits. And they'll come up with many bogus and fantastic explanations like this, which have nothing even remotely common with real life. They're completely detached from reality. These explanations are pure fantasy. Pure fantasy. They're a fairy tale. So what's the actual explanation? Why do you have higher incidence and prevalence of disease in highly developed countries in terms of such non-communicable diseases? Well, first of all, pay attention that having higher incidence and prevalence of a disease does not necessarily mean this is something negative. No, this may be in fact a mark of excellence for the healthcare system of this country. Now, of course, having higher incidence and prevalence of HIV/AIDS is not a mark of excellence. It means that you live in a failed state with failed healthcare. That's why in Europe we have Russia and Ukraine, who have actual AIDS epidemics almost similar to the AIDS epidemics in Africa. But these two countries do not really resemble European states. They are a mess, a complete mess, both of these states. But having more cancer incidence and prevalence is surprisingly a mark of excellence. And it's only logical. You just need to stop and think on this, and you'll see it for yourself. That when does the incidence increase, first of all? The incidence of a disease, so the rate of new cases being registered, diagnosed, increases when objectively more cases of a disease appear. Yes, that's true. So one possible explanation, yes, is some negative change in the environment or the behavioral risk factors. So you have more cases of cancer in this country. But on the other hand, incidence may increase simply because the age structure of the population has changed. Of course, you will have more cases of carcinomas after the age of 50. So, of course, a country with a very aged population will have more cases of cancer, simply because it has higher life expectancy. So more people live up until old age when cancer finally catches up with them. So the first explanation is negative, but the second one is positive. It turns out that higher life expectancy leads to higher incidence of disease, of such diseases of civilization, if we speak popularly, okay. And also, higher incidence means better diagnostics. Of course, a country like Afghanistan, for example, will not have many cancer cases. First of all, the average life expectancy will not be so high, so people do not live long enough to develop so many cases of cancer. Second of all, even if they develop them, there's no one to diagnose them. It is not true that cancer has gotten younger. This is a thing that some people claim, that we see more and more cases of cancer among younger people. That's not true. We simply have better diagnostics. So now we discover cases that have been undetected, undiagnosed for years on before. So higher incidence directly is a direct consequence of better diagnostics in the more developed country. Next, higher prevalence. What does it mean? It is true that higher prevalence may be the result of higher incidence of disease, but it can be a result of something completely different. If you remember the basic equation, prevalence equals incidence multiplied by the duration of a single clinical episode, the duration of disease. So higher prevalence in a developed country is in fact a consequence of higher survival rates. Because if in the underdeveloped country you have two patients with cancer, one of them is, for example, not diagnosed at all, so no one knows there was a case of cancer there, he simply dies and something else is put there as a cause of death in the death certificate. He's omitted from the health statistics. But on the other hand, the second patient who is diagnosed by some miracle dies after 1 year. So the prevalence of cancer in this country would be pretty low Part of the cases are not diagnosed, part of the cases die quickly. So there is no effect of accumulation of the disease among the population. But if we have the same type of cancer in a highly developed country, we have two patients again, both of them are diagnosed, and one of them, for example, lives for 6 years after the diagnosis and the other 5 or 7 years. So what's the end result? The prevalence of disease is much higher because survivability is higher. Better diagnostics, better survivability. So you have to be very careful with these things and do not be fooled into believing that incidence and prevalence are necessarily some negative indicators. On the contrary, they may, in fact, represent advances in medicine. So they are expected to be higher in highly developed countries. Okay, let's continue now. Sources of morbidity data in general. Hospital admissions and discharges, apart of course from the death certificates, which are the most important source here. Outpatient and primary healthcare consultations, specialist services, registers of disease events. Most countries, developed countries, I mean, will have national cancer registers, and also for many rare diseases. Important considerations. To be useful for epidemiological studies, data must be relevant and easily accessible. You can read this later, not so important now. Because of the numerous limitations of routinely recorded morbidity data, many epidemiological studies would rely on the collection of new data through screening methods, questionnaires, measurements of morbidity. Morbidity has been defined as whatever. The WHO Expert Committee on Health Statistics noted in its 6th report that morbidity could be measured in terms of people who are ill, the illnesses, so periods or spells of illness that these persons experienced, and the duration of these illnesses, morbidity rates. 3 aspects of morbidity are commonly measured by morbidity rates, namely frequency, duration, and severity. Disease frequency is measured by incidence and prevalence rates. The average duration per case, or the disability rate, which is the average number of days of disability per person, may serve as a measure of duration. The case fatality rate may be used as an index of severity. We focus on incidence and prevalence rates, which are most commonly used to describe morbidity. Okay, let's skip this now. Incidence again. We have to be very certain about these things because this is something you may be asked during the final state exam. Incidence is defined as the number of new cases occurring in a defined population during a specified period of time. For example, if there had been 500 new cases of an illness in a population of 30,000 in the course of a year, the incidence rate would be 16.7 per 1,000 per year. Note, incidence rate must include the unit of time used in the final expression. If you write 16.7 per 1,000, this would be inadequate. So a more correct expression would be 16.7 per 1,000 per year. Significance. It will be seen from the above definition that incidence rate refers only to new cases during a given period. It's usually 1 year in a specified population or a population at risk. It can also refer to new spells or episodes of disease arising in a given period of time. For example, a person may suffer from common cold more than once a year. If he had suffered twice, which is the situation for most developed countries in the northern hemisphere, he would contribute 2 spells of sickness in that year. So, incidence measures the rate at which new diseases, new cases are occurring in the population. It's not influenced by the duration of the disease, and the use of incidence is generally restricted to acute conditions. Some special incidence rates. Okay, we can skip this now. Uses of incidence. The incidence rate as a health status indicator is useful for taking action to control disease, for research into etiology and pathogenesis, distribution of diseases, efficacy of preventive and therapeutic measures. For instance, if the incidence rate is increasing, it might indicate failure or ineffectiveness of the current control programs. A rising incidence might suggest the need for a new disease control or preventive program, or that reporting practices had improved. A change in the fluctuation in the incidence of disease may also mean a change in the etiology of disease. For example, change in the agent, host, and environmental characteristics. You know that the Delta strains of the SARS-CoV-2 were, of course, more contagious than the previous ones. Analysis of differences in incidence rates reported from various socioeconomic groups and geographical areas may provide useful insights into the effectiveness of health services provided. And now we get to prevalence. The term disease prevalence refers specifically to all current cases, old and new, existing at a given point in time or over a period of time in a given population. A broader definition of prevalence is as follows. The total number of all individuals who have an attribute or disease at a particular time or during a particular period, divided by the population at risk of having the attribute or disease at this point in time or midway through the period. Although referred to as a rate, prevalence rate is really a ratio. Prevalence is of two types: point prevalence, period prevalence. Point prevalence. The point prevalence of a disease is defined as the number of all current cases of a disease at one point in time in relation to a defined population. The point in point prevalence, now that's a major warning here, may for all practical purposes consist of a day, several days, or even a few weeks, dependent upon the time it takes to examine the population sample. For example, if it's calculated on the basis of some screening program, it's of course dependent on the time it takes to finish the screening in this particular population. Now, when the term prevalence rate is used without any further qualification, it is taken to mean point prevalence. It can be made specific for age, sex, and other relevant factors or attributes. A less commonly used measure of prevalence is the period prevalence. It measures the frequency of all current cases, old and new, existing during a defined period of time, for example, annual prevalence, expressed in relation to a defined population. It includes cases arising before, but extending into or through to the year, as well as those cases arising during the year. So it looks a lot like the incidence, but apparently, it includes cases inherited from previous years as well. That's the difference with incidence, because incidence will only register the cases that have been registered during this particular year, not cases registered during previous years. So again, the common rule is incidence is applied to, it is used when we measure the burden of disease from an acute disease. Because anyway, cases in an acute disease like COVID-19 appear and then disappear all of a sudden during the year. There is no effect in general of accumulation, but prevalence is applied in the case of measuring the disease burden from a chronic disease, because Once diabetes type 1, for example, happens, it won't disappear. It won't go anywhere. It remains there. Yes, the patient is diagnosed in this year, but he will continue to be present in the statistics. He will continue to live with the disease in the next year, the year after next, and so on and so forth. Relationship between prevalence and incidence. I already told you this. Prevalence depends upon two factors, the incidence and duration of illness. Given the assumption that the population is stable, yes, the equation works best in this case. And incidence and duration are unchanging. The relationship can be expressed as P equals I multiplied by D. Example, incidence, 10 cases per 1,000 population per year. Mean duration of disease, 5 years. So the person remains ill for 5 years. Prevalence, 10 multiplied by 5, so it's 50 per 1,000 population. Interrelationships. The above equation shows that the longer the duration of the disease, the greater its prevalence. For example, tuberculosis has a high prevalence rate relative to incidence. This is because new cases of tuberculosis keep cropping up throughout the year, while the old ones may persist for months or years. On the other hand, if the disease is acute and of short duration, either because of a rapid recovery or death, the two possible outcomes of the disease, the prevalence rate will be relatively low compared with the incidence rate. In some diseases, for example, food poisoning, the disease is so short-lived that there are no old cases at all. The same is true of conditions which are rapidly fatal, such as homicides. Strictly speaking, these events have no prevalence. In other words, decrease in prevalence may take place not only from a decrease in incidence, but also from a decrease of the duration of illness, through either more rapid recovery or more rapid death. So, again, this important warning. Lower prevalence of a disease in a less developed country does not mean that the situation has improved. No, it means that the situation has deteriorated. For example, Syria will have a higher prevalence of child malnutrition and everything affiliated with it in comparison to Somalia. And it's not because child malnutrition is children threatened by famine. This is more widespread in Syria than in Somalia. It's because it's less fatal. It's less severe. So yes, these children will be malnourished, but they will not die. In Somalia and many other African countries, malnourished children will quickly die. So they'll disappear from the statistics. The disease is over. Does this mean that the situation is better? No, it's far worse, in fact. Interrelationships continued. When we see a change in prevalence from one time period to another, this can result from changes in incidence, changes in duration of disease, or both. For example, improvements in treatment may decrease the duration of illness and thereby decrease prevalence of a disease. But if the treatment is such that by preventing death and at the same time not producing recovery, just as it happens in chronic diseases, it may give rise to the apparently paradoxical effect of an increase in prevalence. Further, if the duration is decreased sufficiently, a decrease in prevalence could take place despite an increase in incidence. Interrelationships again. Prevalence has been compared with a photograph, an instantaneous record, a snapshot, and incidence with a film, a continuous record. Both the terms may perhaps be better understood by taking into consideration the coffee house example. After the cafeteria opens in the morning, people keep entering and leaving, each one remaining inside the coffee house for a short while. At any point of time, say 10 a.m., We could go into the cafeteria and count people over there. The cafe. This corresponds to estimating the prevalence. The rate at which people enter the cafe, say 10 people per hour, is the incidence. The limitations. It is important to know that the limitations exist to the prevalence rate. It's not the ideal measure for studying disease etiology or causation. We have seen that two factors determine prevalence, namely incidence and duration. Incidence is related to the occurrence of disease and duration to factors which affect the course of the disease. In other words, the element of duration reflects the prognostic factors, while incidence reflects causal factors. Therefore, incidence rates should be optimally used in the formulation and testing of etiological hypotheses. When incidence rates are not available, prevalence rates may have to be used. Uses of prevalence, disease problems in the community, and to identify potential high-risk populations, also for administrative and planning purposes. For example, hospital beds, manpower needs, rehabilitation facilities, etc. Of course, no sort of planning of healthcare is possible without having prevalence data. Okay, so we are finished. We are finished pretty quickly today. And as for incidence, I told you during the previous days that it is mostly used to diagnose an epidemic, so to speak. So we have 10,000 new cases during this week. Okay, now we'll proclaim officially an epidemic. We have to restrict. Then planned surgeries, hospital admissions, visitations, visits by relatives to the hospital. We have to stop classes at schools, kindergartens, etc. But prevalence is used for even more important purposes because prevalence allows us to plan for healthcare. And you can't do this in a day. You need to know the number of patients in your country living with arterial hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cancer, etc., etc. What are the localizations? What are the clinical stages? And then you need stockpiles of these and these drugs. And everything has to be pre-planned because you need to import these after successful tenders, bids with global pharmaceutical companies, and they cannot respond so quickly to the needs of everyone. So you have to plan ahead, years ahead. Notify them of your needs, buy the necessary stockpiles. Otherwise, you run out of drugs in the course of the year. And some patients will be left with no treatment. Or you have too large stockpiles. Then many of the drugs and vaccines will expire. You have to throw them away. It's a huge waste when, of course, healthcare is always short on money. So more or less, you have to plan precisely what sorts of stockpiles you need in the country of drugs, vaccines, diagnostic tests, surgical materials. There are so many of them. Okay. Any questions arising now?
No, Professor, thank you.
No, doctor, everything was clear.
Okay, so tomorrow we'll have the National Health System, so the organization of healthcare, and we'll finish on Friday with healthcare for specific populations, meaning maternal, childcare, and healthcare for the elderly citizens. These are the so-called specific populations, different from the normal working population of a country. So tomorrow we'll have to discuss briefly, or rather I should remind you of these things that we've already discussed in the second course. So the health system as a whole, hospital care, primary care, emergency, urgent care, specialized outpatient care. Okay, any other questions? No?
No, doctor.
Okay. So have a nice day, everyone, and see you again tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Bye bye. Have a good day.
Bye. Have
Bye,
a nice
doctor.
day. Bye.